There we go. We're live. Had to wait a little bit there. Hey, welcome to Lean Lunch. I am your host, Aaron Eden. I'm one of the principals here at Moves the Needle, and we should have my co-host and co-founder Brant Cooper joining us in just a few minutes. We'll give him a second to catch up. Real quickly, Moves the Needle. We help enterprises to transform their culture into one where customer focus, rapid experimentation, evidence-based decision-making, all those things really drive continuous innovation. And the goal is really to help your enterprise to move at the speed of a startup. And our proven programs really deepen your customer empathy skills, accelerate your product pipeline, and they infuse your whole organization with the power of entrepreneurship. And the purpose of Lean Lunch each week is really just to have some hopefully really in-depth conversations with employees and leaders that are applying these Lean startup principles inside their own organizations. And really extract a few nuggets, a few insights, some things that hopefully you can apply right away in your own organizations, and really just help move the community forward as a result. And so this week we have the pleasure of our guests are Josh Cochrane, who is the VP of Product Development for Palo Alto Software. Hi, Josh.
Hi there.
And we've also got Noah Parsons from Palo Alto Software. He's the Chief Operating Officer.
Hi there.
And I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit more deeply than that, but make sure you know who the other heads are that are down there in the bottom. So for me, I actually ran into Josh at one of the SteepLink Educators conferences, and I think this conversation is going to be really valuable on a couple of different levels. First off, really to learn about some of the pitfalls that organizations run into when applying Lean startup principles in their organizations, right? And how to get around some of those pitfalls and what it's like to actually go through these things, right? Like as a coach and a mentor and an instructor, I can talk about these things all I want, but until you hear real stories about other people going through it, it probably is less likely to hit home. And then the second thing is really to see how the Palo Alto team has been able to take some of these Lean startup tools and techniques and apply them directly with their customers to be more successful. So not just applying it in their organization to make their products more successful, but going beyond that and really infusing it into how their customers work, which I think is very forward thinking and something that a lot of enterprises strive to figure out how they can sort of use these tools in multiple different ways. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. So why don't I first start off by having Noah and Josh quickly just introduce themselves, give a little background to folks about Palo Alto Software and your journey to where you are today.
Great. I'll go first. I'm Noah. I've been at Palo Alto Software for 12 years now, so a long time. Working in various jobs, and now currently the COO here. I've been working in online companies of one form or another since the mid-90s, starting at Yahoo, and then helping start a company called Epinions.com after that, and then doing a few other small things before coming to Palo Alto Software. So it's been an exciting journey. I think our biggest challenge over the past 4 or 5 years was actually transforming the company from a Windows desktop installed software as our primary product to an entirely new platform, not just from a product perspective, but also from a business model perspective, moving to subscription business, building an entirely new product, reinventing that product along the way. And the really interesting thing about all of it is that we're in the business planning industry, and that simultaneously is changing dramatically with the Lean principles. And so we wanted to, at the same time as we reinvented the company, actually reinvent what business planning could be, because it's not about just the document, as everyone knows. It's kind of a dead principle, but moving towards Lean planning ongoing continuous planning and bringing that to Main Street America, who's most of our customer base. So obviously lean principles have a great foothold in high tech and in Silicon Valley and places like that, but we feel like they've yet to reach mainstream America, and we'd like to do that. So both from our product and then also how we're actually implementing these things in-house.
Beautiful. And how about for you, Josh?
I'm head of product currently for Palo Alto. That's almost entirely focused on LivePlan at this point. I've been with the company for about 8 years now, and the first half of that time I spent heading up our online marketing operation. We have a pretty sophisticated, content marketing organization, search marketing. So spent a lot of time really digging deep into web analytics, conversion optimization, and kind of that part of the web. Prior to being with the company, I had been with a company that does ERP software in a product management role and a number of other kind of positions there. And so kind of had the background in product and the background then in web work. And so when we decided to pivot the company and really reinvent ourselves on the web, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to kind of lead that charge. And part of that, like you were saying in the kickoff, Aaron, part of that was about finding the right sort of model for us internally, finding tools and principles and approaches and processes and all the rest that would really support us achieving our goals and doing a good job of building software. Part of the challenge for us is because we serve so many small businesses, we have such a broad target market that there's a lot of benefit in trying to find proven models elsewhere, find good ideas and innovations, and figure out how to adapt those to help, not just Silicon Valley startups and, maybe software companies like us, but also bike shops and nail salons and food trucks and just all of those just regular businesses out there. And I think there's a lot of great stuff out there that we can adapt, but there's an adaptation involved. And so that was part of when I met you at the Berkeley event, part of the focus there was really trying to understand what the principles and the approach was that was coming out of the Valley, and with that and with lots of other things that we've looked at, just thinking about what the useful parts are that we can bring to our customers and say, hey, as a small business, here are things that you can do that will make your business, less risky, more successful, faster growing, better managed.
That makes sense. Awesome. Thank you. Hey, Brant, how are you?
Good. Sorry, I was having Google plugin problems.
Yeah, we all were. No worries. It's been one of those mornings with the Google Hangout. So cool. Yeah, we're just getting started. So for Josh and Noah, I'd like to ask maybe start by telling us a little bit about the story of the journey that your organization has taken, with these lean startup principles. How did you first find out about it? What are some of the things that you did first as you discovered the power of some of these principles?
I can start. I think it first started learning about the principles with Steve Blank's first book, The 4 Steps to Epiphany, and then obviously Eric Ries's book really sort of took that to the next level and helped establish processes that just made a ton of sense for us as we were transitioning the business. And we are also, and Josh can speak to this more, coming off of a very traditional waterfall-style development model with a single annual release, which in Windows packaged and installed software had at the time made more sense. But it's these, you are gathering up all these requirements, building things for a year, testing, releasing, hoping it's right, shipping all these disks to big box stores and hoping it all works out. And so there's very little in that process that lets you actually gather feedback and iterate along the way. So moving obviously to a web-based product gave us the opportunity to do all this constant iteration and refinement and gathering user feedback along the way, and stuff that we've been doing very much on our internet marketing side of things. So we're very sort of familiar with continuous iteration and testing, but to be able to bring that to the product was really pretty revolutionary for us. And I'll let Josh speak to this more, but our initial release was really a classic MVP. It was very, very, very lightweight product that we were on the edge of being embarrassed to actually put out there. That it just didn't simply have core things that we were pretty sure it needed, but at the same time we knew that we needed to get the basics out there and get them out the door to understand what the reaction would be, what people liked, what they didn't like, and then iterate from there. So we really released a very classic MVP to start, and have continued with the MVP process from there, and really moving it into a minimum viable feature mode rather than product per se, and iterating on every feature. But that's also led to some of what we found as some pitfalls to lean as well. Maybe Josh, you want to jump in and add some more color to that story?
Sure. I mean, I think from my perspective, one of the big challenges that we faced early on was we very quickly, when we started the LivePlan project, we grabbed on to Scrum and Agile development as a way to move faster, to kind of control feature creep, and to keep things sort of more organized as we started to build out. And that was from the very beginning, and we've been through dozens and dozens of iterations now, and the continuous sort of process refinement that happens there, we're a lot better at it now than we were then. But even at that point in time, it was working really well, and we were moving pretty quickly with a small team, and that was creating a challenge for me on the UX side to say, how do we prep work fast enough that it's ready for these guys to build and crank out, and potentially, before long we had a live product where we're actually updating code that real people were using on a daily basis. That UX challenge was tough because with a fast-moving schedule, there's a risk that we would design something that would be off base and it would be built and in the wild before we had time to sort of realize that we were on the wrong path. And so, in the past, even before Palo Alto, I was a big fan of sketching and lightweight wireframing and some of the sort of early feedback tools. Pretty early on in this project, I'd read a book called Inspired by one of the former executives at eBay, who was a big fan of kind of rapid, cheap prototyping, both as a way to do things quickly and get feedback, but also as a way to avoid attachment. If you write something on a whiteboard and you say, it could be like this, and then the feedback comes back and says, well, that doesn't really work, it only takes a second to sort of wipe it off. If you go the next step, you build out a beautiful interactive wireframe, you put all the Photoshop work into it, God forbid actually build the thing and somebody has built back-end code to support it that's elegant and they're proud of, and they'd love this kind of, you get all this attachment to stuff that is really counterproductive. And so we're a big fan of sort of moving fast with things that we're really happy to kind of throw away. And I feel like that was becoming an entrenched part of our process before we read Eric Ries's book and were exposed to kind of the MVP name around it, which does a nice job of kind of organizing that same set of concepts and saying, how do you test something quickly and cheaply? I feel like when we read that, we were like, oh yeah, that, sure, let's call that MVP and let's do that all the time. And that has gradually, that's been a big part of our development process, but it's also spread out and it affects a lot of the stuff that like Noah's team does with online marketing tests and pricing tests that we do. And I mean, really throughout our business, it's become a pretty common thing to talk about, well, this idea that we think might have something to it, is there a way to MVP that so that we can get a faster, cheaper answer before we spend a lot of time building something we might be attached to that's not the right thing?
Have you actually formalized the process of putting these things in front of real customers?
Yeah, so we have a user researcher and a UX analyst as part of our team, and we do a lot of feedback collection. We do a lot of proactive sort of general user research. We try to keep that flow of customer conversations regular, which gives us the ability then, as things come up, to be able to share those and say, we're going to be talking to people anyway, let's show them sketches, concepts, interactive stuff. The biggest challenge that we have right now is just still the pace of our work. We're still building things fast enough that finding enough time in the process, it depends a lot on our certainty level. And sometimes we say, okay, we're pretty confident, we know where we're going, we've built or designed a relatively lightweight version of it, and we're going to proceed and get feedback during like the QA phase for refinement. And other times we take the concept out and we say, okay, we really need to go show this to a bunch of people. One of the really nice things about our business, it's just sort of a lucky detail of the way that we work, is that because we serve so many just mainstream businesses, we know lots of people who have businesses like that, and we're in the sort of the downtown area for our city that we're in, and we can go for a walk and go find customers and
Right.
Keep those conversations. That makes it a little bit different than if we were like the business that I worked in prior to Palo Alto was mostly serving industrial enterprises on the other side of the country or across the world, and so it was much more of a production, like getting really good user feedback and really seeing their environment and all the rest mostly involved like airplanes. So it's pretty nice to go for a walk instead.
Right. Yeah. What some companies do, like on Meetup.com, which I always find interesting, is that they'll just schedule a day every week, but other companies maybe it'd be once a month, and then they just have somebody in charge of going and collecting these people, and they bring them to the office every week at Meetup.com, and so then that allows anybody inside the organization to then schedule time with these people that are actually going to be in the office, and it's a way to sort of get that cadence so that you always know that there's going to be people there that you can schedule some amount of time with.
Right.
And I think in the what's that?
I was just going to say that's definitely where we're aiming. I think the challenge that we're in right now from a user research perspective is just getting the process dialed in enough to have the cadence part of it. Right now we have sort of regular, irregular stuff that happens and a benefit to it, which is great. But just like 2 days ago I was talking with our user researcher, and she was saying, I want to get to the point where we have a reproducible process where we're not running into dry spells and then rushing out and trying to find more people, but rather just saying, well, we're constantly talking to people, and that way if you want to do usability testing or you have a new developer on staff and you want to get them up to speed, you can have those opportunities regularly. We just recently hired an engineer from HP, and it was interesting. In part of the interview process, he was saying, he'd been there for 2 decades and had never met a customer. So really thinking about that in our context of like, we don't really want you to go that many days before you meet a customer. Like that should be just part of the context of being able to do your job.
Yeah, there's Mary Poppendick, who's an author that's written a lot about lean software, said at a conference I attended one time that engineers are actually supposed to be engineering solutions to a problem, and so really to properly engineer a solution, you need to understand the problem, and then the access to the customers is pretty important in that process. Otherwise, you're really more of a developer versus an engineer. So,
I think the other thing we're doing to try and at least get out of the building, beyond just our regional neighborhood here, is involving more people who normally wouldn't be part of the user research process per se, so that people who are traveling anyway to start putting together meetups or just gathering users and emailing them from wherever area, whoever happens to be traveling, just to get more of that exposure, both from within the company to expose really anyone who happens to be on the road to the customer base and be able to have them make that connection, and so that's been a lighter weight and more affordable way to actually get in front of customers, because you're not sending out teams explicitly to do user research. So it has a dual benefit of being cost effective and also just gathering more feedback, because I think all the local small businesses around here eventually do get tired of us opening their doors and asking them how they're working and what they're doing and why they're using whatever credit card swiper and all that kind of stuff. So trying to expand that footprint has been an initiative that we're really trying to push forward on in a cost-effective way.
Yep.
You guys talked. You talked just a little bit about the visual executive summary, sort of as a feature of LivePlan, and and that being kind of one of the early areas where you started making a lot of progress applying these things, startup principles. Can you dive a little bit deeper into that journey? What are some of the you said that maybe that V1 was something you guys were embarrassed about and those kinds of things. Can you guys go a little bit deeper on what were some of the things that that initially you thought it should be, and what were some of the things that you learned very quickly, and how did you iterate on that product?
Sure. So we initially launched LivePlan as just a basic, more traditional business planning product, and it didn't even have a real cash flow at the time, which it was really for anyone who's doing financial forecasting, and having a cash flow forecast is a pretty critical component, especially if you're starting a company that has anything to do with inventory or is selling to other businesses. There's a lag on payments or receivables and things like that. So it's a pretty important piece, but and which we have now, obviously. But initially we just decided we needed to get this thing out there just to validate some basic assumptions about our market. We had been ridden on assumptions that yes, people wanted to do this stuff in the browser, that the current market that we attract would seamlessly switch from desktop installed software to an online product, that subscription model could work in our market, figuring out what that pricing should be. All of that, we had all these open questions and assumptions, and we needed to just get something out there to start validating, even if the product wasn't feature complete in any real way, and it obviously still isn't. But we felt like we needed to start figuring out the core assumptions, and certainly we talked to people, but getting in front of a larger audience to really validate the basics, fundamentals of how the business model was going to work was really, really important to us. And as we built on these principles, we felt that we needed to bring those principles to our target market, like we were talking about earlier, that our particular target market of Main Street small businesses isn't really in touch so much with the lean methodologies. The minimum viable product concept isn't something that they have necessarily heard of, the vast majority of them. And so that's where we brought in and added the visual executive summary feature to LivePlan to basically take inspired by Lean Canvas and the business model canvas, but bring that in a more accessible way to the average small business, in a way that they'd understand, in a visually appealing way that they could share with business partners, investors, et cetera, and have them instantly understand how it works. And so we wanted to make that more mainstream. So adding that feature was beneficial to us, for our own business, to really examine how we would look at business model canvas and use that ourselves, and then bring that to the end user and making that more attainable in a more manageable package without having to go read a bunch of books or go to a class, and basically self-serve in that side of things.
Yeah, I think the feature that we're talking about, which ended up being called the pitch within LivePlan, it's interesting because it provides kind of a tiny demonstration case of kind of how lean startup and sort of iterative design work. I mean, it's just a feature within our product, but at the same time, it kind of mirrored the process that a lot of startups go through. So in this case, the problem that we had is that Noah and I and a bunch of other people on our staff, we spend a lot of time reviewing business plans for planning competitions that we act as judges for, and a lot of those plans can come from all over the place. They can come from English as a second language writers. They can come from people who are great at inventing a new medical device, but don't have a lot of familiarity with business. All sorts of different templates and all the rest. So what happens is we get assigned a pile of these 20 or 30 page documents to read, and it's hard to, especially after you've been through a round or two of them, it's hard to avoid that initial feeling of just kind of digging into the pile and going, ugh, like this is off-putting, you know. And so we talked about, you know, the pros and cons of trying to do planning in prose and trying to maintain written content like that. We had this idea, the idea of like the visual executive summary with kind of, you know, it was a very nebulous concept that we kicked around to say there should be a better way to, at a glance, see what's in these 20-page documents, short of flipping through, trying to figure out how the content's been organized, and then reading all the words and looking at the tables and whatnot. So we really did kind of bat it around at that sort of level, like, hey, we feel like we have a problem we're solving, we have some ideas on what a solution might be. One of the early steps was we went through a bunch of these plans and we just made notes and said, if we were going to just pull stuff out and maybe, you know, express it in some visual way, what are the pieces of the plan we think would be really important? And that was right around the time that we were starting to kind of get up to speed on lean startup stuff. We played with the business model canvas a little bit and some other tools like that to try to understand how they were kind of tackling the challenge and feeling like they were doing a slightly different thing for a different sort of user, but there were some similarities in approach. And so we ended up going down this path of, you know, gradually kind of carving away at this big chunk of wood until we found, you know, the sort of the key insight, which is like an infographic view that at a glance summarizes the things that we think are important in your business strategy and that you should know for yourself and that you can communicate to others. And then we went through like a million different versions of playing with moving content around, figuring out which things should be in which order, at what level of prominence, expressed in what sort of manner. And throughout that process, we created some very early, you know, sketched out prototypes, some early Photoshop designs, and we showed those to people internally, and we showed those to customers and prospects and other people that we knew, family members. We just tried to get as much feedback as we could. I actually took like the 1.0 version of the Photoshop layout to the Berkeley event that Aaron and I were at, and got a chance to sit down with Steve Blank and Jim Hornthal and say, hey, you know, here's what we do. We kind of do business planning for regular, you know, mainstream businesses, and we've come up with this concept. And Steve was very quick to go, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I've always felt like these principles would apply to mainstream businesses. That's just not the environment in which we live. We live in sort of high growth, you know, venture funded, sort of valley land, and so that was encouraging. And I think, you know, like Noah was saying, we
Whoops.
will use it. Do they understand it? Do they come back and ask for lots of improvements and suggest, you know, issues? And that's really, it feels like what happened is that through our own use and through customer feedback and testing that we had an opportunity to refine that functionality and come up with something that feels like it's a really good fit for our market, and it's proven to be really popular with users.
Right. I'd like to dive down a little deeper on that. It's an interesting take. It is a different market segment, right? The scalable startup versus the Main Street business or the small business, and the way we've sort of always thought about it in the lean startup world is that the scalable startups, their uncertainty is different than what the Main Street business is. And so the uncertainty is what drives the experiment, and uncertainty differentiated from risk, right? So everybody's got risk. You can failure to execute is a risk. Whereas if you just simply execute on something that's unknown, like am I even building a product that people care about, is an uncertainty, and so you want to experiment around it. But I think it's interesting that there's a lot of mainstream businesses that probably face similar uncertainty, and so it seems like you've carved out a niche, which is exactly what we try to teach everybody to do, and then solve that problem that those have that's different than say the scalable startup. So do you feel like you're tackling a similar part? It's about the uncertainty, or is it diminishing execution risk, or a combination of that?
I think a lot of the challenge with us is adapting to the position of our customers. So I would say, you know, the bulk, So in the early period when we were really focused on the initial plan creation market, we focused on a design persona, this guy Garrett, who has a bike shop, and he sort of represented the bulk of the people we talked to, which is people who are passionate about their business idea, and they often have high level of subject matter expertise or skill. So they're good at cutting hair, they're good at making baked goods, they love films, but they've never run, a movie theater or a hair shop or whatever before. And
and they typically get their investment capital from the same sources, right? It's either credit cards or banks, right?
Right. Yeah, that's the typical pattern, and I think that's important, for two reasons. One is I think you have to reduce the intimidation and provide support and education to enable somebody like Garrett to figure out what it means to get a bike shop up and running and how to manage it once he's done that. So I think that's important. I think the other thing that's really key is the nature of the conversation that you have with, with a VC fund, for example. It's just very different than the nature of the conversation with a bank. Like the VC fund wants to know about your acquisition costs and your lifetime value and your scalable model and where the risks are in the profit. Like there's a certain mindset of what deals look like and how they compare to other deals. Whereas the bank wants to know, like, first off, like, can I have your house? Like, do you have a house if this doesn't work? Have you ever run a business before? What makes you well-positioned? It's at a much more fundamental level. And so I think that, it's not so much about just getting the funding. And, if that's all it was, we would focus on just making, a great initial plan creation tool and call it good, because that's so much of what the banks are about. What we've seen through decades in this market is so many people invest lots of effort into that initial concept and plan, and then they don't have a process to manage the change, and the plan is going to be wrong. You're going to have to adjust to assumptions that prove incorrect, timing problems, cash flow problems, whatever those things are. You need to constantly be taking those into account. You may need to do a bigger move, pivot your business, figure out how to experiment with different models and whatnot to really make that work. And so many businesses historically, I think, have not had that, and just sort of pick a path and then they play that path out until either they win or lose, and then they're done. And that's really the core of what we're trying to do, is to keep the process, lean and agile from the start, and enable businesses to be able to say, okay, we thought we were going to build this app and we were going to deliver it in March, and we'd start getting revenue in March, and we'd use that revenue to do these things, and now we're not going to deliver it until June, and so we can't spend that money because we didn't make that revenue. We need to make alternate plans. We need to recognize early on that we need more funding. We need, there's all these things that you can do, but you have to have, the right sort of tools to be aware of what those opportunities are.
We also wanted to help small businesses avoid initial risk. We've all seen the countless Main Street businesses that open up and then close their doors 3-6 months later, the restaurants that don't make it, and things like that.
The percentages are actually pretty high, I think, of the lifetime of those small businesses is pretty short on average.
Right. Yeah, you have I think half failing within the first 2 years, 80% within 5. Their lifetime is, it's a very treacherous thing to do to start a small business like that. Especially as Josh mentioned, when you're putting your house or your personal savings or your friends and family savings on the line in the process. And so we wanted to really help people think through what they're doing to reduce that initial risk, and then help them track their progress and refine as they go. And we found a lot of people aren't asking themselves just the fundamental questions of, am I actually solving a problem in my market? And even for a sort of, let's say, call it a cookie cutter business of a hair salon, where every town has many hair salons, and that's great. But to have people think about, well, what's making you unique? How do you stand out from the next person down the street? Is it on service? Is it on price? Are you targeting a certain demographic? And it's surprising how many small businesses don't really ask those questions. And so we wanted to make that a very easy process to go through where you can say, yes, this is the problem that I'm solving, this is my solution, and then most importantly, really ask about the target market, and not in that you're trying to do, TAM, SAM, SOM model. I mean, that, any of these business school cases, but to really say, great, this, who is the person? Who is that persona that you would like to walk in your door every day? And think about it that way. And to make sure then that everything you're doing actually lines up with that target. And then also thinking about things like location, which is not really a thing that Silicon Valley tech startup needs to think about so much. And asking those questions in an approachable way so you can quickly refine those. And then also, as you gather more data and do some additional research, so you go out to the location that you're thinking about starting a business at, and turns out there's not the foot traffic you might have thought there was. You can quickly refine that process, and then as you get up and running, really track what you're doing. Way too often, small businesses are getting managed out of their checking account effectively. And there aren't necessarily financial goals, or even looking back and looking at last year's performance. So, well, how did things actually go as summer came? Should I be preparing for an uptick? Should I be preparing for a downtrend? Getting access to that data in an easy way so you can refine your marketing and your inventory management, things like that as you go is really, really important. And so that's what we're trying to do. So it's very much bringing that ongoing iterative process to more of a real-world environment. So not just to where it feels like it's more typically applied in software and digital products where you're changing things in a more virtual world than rather in a physical world.
Nice.
Sorry, I had a question, but I was choking. Excuse me. Luckily, my mic was muted. We've talked quite a bit about how you guys have taken these principles and really started pushing them out to your customer base, and of course learning from them through that process and those kinds of things. But one of the other things that I promised the audience at the beginning was that we talk about some of the challenges, some of the things you guys ran into internally as you were trying to work this new way, right? You've got this huge shift of trying to change your entire business model, shift how you're doing development, how you're doing customer empathy, all these kinds of things, and in addition incorporate some of the new lean startup principles. Like that had to be a little bit of madness. So what are some of the things that you guys ran into internally when trying to apply these principles?
One of the biggest issues that we found, especially in trying to move as fast as possible, was that we would come up with a minimum viable feature for the product, maybe test it in sketch level, things like that, implement the basic version of that feature with the intent of gathering additional data as people actually used it in the product and measuring results and looking at all of that. But then making sure that we actually scheduled the appropriate development time to go back and actually follow up and take that feature to the intended level after we had the initial learnings. So the pitfalls that we found is that you can end up with a product that is full of minimum viable features, where you keep adding the next thing while you're waiting to gather data and learn more about the first thing you built, and then you don't loop back to that first thing and say, well, we had all these grand plans if the data told us that it was successful, or if the user said that they love this thing. And so we've had a bit of those kinds of problems of, okay, great, you have to actually go back and take it to where you intended it to go, and scheduling the right amount of time for that. And sometimes actually you learn something and you say, okay, well, we shouldn't go back and do anything, and that's fine. But more often than not, we built some stuff because it was actually pretty decent once it got out into the wild, but then needed to follow up on it. And I think that was that's continually one of the biggest pitfalls we've found with Lean is that you have to finish what you start. It's
It's a great point. We talk about, again, sort of the unknown versus the known. The purpose of the MVP is to move the unknown over to the known bucket, and then once it's known, you execute as if as you normally would, right? And build it out. And there's whole startups that have, oh yeah, we've got this minimum viable product. It's, we've got our target market. It's product market fit. We're great. And then now I'm going to go become a sales and marketing organization, and they leave the product as an MVP. And they're just ripe for disruption again as somebody else comes on, learns about that, the same MVP level, and then executes on and builds out the product. So it's a great point.
The key insight from my perspective is, in our case, we were talking before, we're making a concerted effort to do user research, to do usability testing, we actually benefit from the fact that we use our product ourselves internally, so we get lots of insight there. I don't think it's a matter of saying, we failed to come up with ideas of how to improve features or to sort of have those in the queue or attention has moved on. That's not the part of the challenge that I struggle with. The thing that I struggle with is you MVP a major new feature. Maybe it's a great idea that you had that you're really excited about, something like, our sort of visual approach to summarizing a business plan, for example. You come up with that idea and you put together an MVP version of it. You get it live so that you can learn stuff. And then you're doing follow-up development. You have additional sprints coming. And we have a whole bunch of great, big, interesting ideas. And so the temptation is to say, well, now can we MVP this other really big, cool thing that we'd like to do? And what happens, in my experience, is that the projects that you come up with, the user stories to incrementally improve those MVP features that you've come up with, or that that new area of the product, when you're comparing stuff on a priority list and deciding what to put in the next sprint, that stuff individually, it all looks kind of small and lower return compared to, it's a little bit like a football game, and you've got a chance to throw it downfield. It's like, well, hey, let's throw it downfield again, and let's see if we can get another big gain, rather than sort of consolidating the gain that we just got. And I think that's the key insight from my perspective was to say you have to sort of structurally provide time for that, where you have capacity that is dedicated to following up on MVP learnings, separate from the next new MVP or the new feature or whatever. And it's kind of the same approach that we've taken, forever with, the technology side, with updating our infrastructure and refactoring older code and sort of tending the garden. We don't require those stories to compete with the next new feature idea. That's kind of what we've ended up having to do. We just recently we did a major redesign and expansion of our scoreboard functionality, which is where we sort of enable you to track your actual performance against your plan and your past performance and have a better sense of how things are going. And part of what we did, kind of because of this discussion we've had about this sort of quality trap that's built into the MVP process, is to say, after we go live, let's make sure that we use some of our upcoming capacity to do work yet to be determined. And then we did usability testing, and we used the product ourselves, and we got customer feedback, and then we did a bunch of projects, and now we're just kind of on the tail end where it feels like, okay, we've now kind of consolidated that gain, and we're ready to jump into the next big thing.
That's awesome. Hey, I've got a question from one of our viewers. Scott is asking if you guys have a specifically defined product ownership role with your development teams, or using some sort of hybrid or differentiated approach now that you're applying lean principles.
Sorry, did you say product ownership role? Yeah, in my case, I function as the product owner within our Scrum team. That said, we're a 50-person organization, and so I'm, from a product strategy and priority perspective, obviously working really closely with Noah, daily and regularly checking in with the rest of the executive team. And what we tend to do is to review product opportunities, on a regular basis, monthly or so, but also as an ongoing conversation. And we always have this sort of short list that we're shuffling, but we're doing that review so commonly that it's really about, okay, what's the next thing that we're going to jump into? Great, we did that. What's the next thing? And so we have a guiding list of things that we'd like to do there, but at the same time, we're not in a mode of saying, I think sometimes people they try to do Agile in a way that's sort of waterfallish, and they say, okay, we're going to do a review batch of all this work, and then we're going to book the next 6 sprints in a row to walk through that list. And I would say we've never made it through a short list without changing the list halfway through, because that's what the learning process lends itself to.
Awesome, thank you. So we got in a little bit into the the barriers around getting stuck in MVP land and going back. Were there any other big things that you guys ran into? How about typically what we see with companies is that this is also a cultural shift with the employees. Did you run into any issues around that? Any backlash from folks not wanting to work this way or other areas?
Yeah, and we practice the same kind of principles on our marketing team as well, with how we execute marketing campaigns and build out new functionality on some of our content sites and things like that. So we really tried to bring this into the whole organization. But as we've done that, there's definitely hurdles around understanding the level of quality for a minimum viable product or feature, and not letting the quality hamper the test results, but at the same time really trying to cut down on feature lists and what the wish list might be for a particular addition to the product or the site. I think that's been the biggest challenge organizationally, is getting people to think down into what is the absolute core single thing that you're trying to validate, and what's the best way to get there. Because everyone always looks at some of these features that we develop and or additions to our marketing sites and say, wow, that I thought we were going to do X, Y, and Z more, and to really instill in everyone that we're really just trying to learn this one thing, and if we learn this one thing, that's going to tell us that we should build feature X, Y, Z afterwards. But that sort of acceptance of this much smaller version of the vision is an initial challenge, but then also balancing that with that much smaller vision can't be low quality. It can't look bad. It can't have bad design. It can't have quickly written copy or anything like that. But even if it's minimal, that doesn't mean poor quality work, or that you just kind of dashed it off and didn't spend the time to do it well. And so it's striking that balance that minimum doesn't mean shoddy. And that was a really more challenging thing within the organization, to get people to understand that minimum can be hard, and executing something simple and basic is not as trivial as the end result often looks.
I think the other thing that is sort of interesting from our perspective, because it's not like we were in the middle of this project when we sort of adopted these principles and we did a big pivot point. It was more like we were involved in a legacy sort of lifestyle business that was focused on a model of creating an annual release of a product that was well established as a market leader. And I think there were some people on the marketing team that really struggled from the early days, and actually we ended up with a fair amount of turnover on that part of the business, in just getting out of the mode of saying, we're just incrementally changing something that we've already had. And I think that the flip side to Agile and to the quick changing nature of it is that some people can be unsettled by that if they're folks who would much rather work in a world where it says, here's our delivery schedule. Q1, we're going to give you this. In Q2, we're going to give you that. In Q3, and here's these dates. And if you're managing deals or putting campaigns together or whatever, you can really think about, like, what's the right thing to happen 6 months from now that you want to plan for. And so I think in the early days of us using Scrum, there were definitely conversations that where some people on staff would be frustrated by the idea of like, well, when is this coming? You know, and then from my perspective, I can say, I can tell you which features are in QA right now when we'll go live next Friday, and I can tell you which ones we're coding on this 2-week sprint, and I can tell you which ones we're doing UX work to get ready for estimation next week. And then beyond that, I can share with you, you know, what we're currently thinking in terms of the short list of what might come next. But there's no sense, really, I mean, there's no commitment beyond the broader sense to say, what are we doing, you know, 6 months from now? That changes a lot, and I think that's great from a, you know, having worked in a waterfall environment in the past. From a product planning perspective, it's a great way to work. It is a different mindset for, you know, for sales, marketing, biz dev, and I feel like our staff has come around to understanding that, and that it works well now. There definitely was a transition and kind of some learning and a certain amount of, you know, finding the right people for that model.
And beyond internally, I think that there's a major external factor there. You know, we do a lot of different partnerships and collaborate with other companies, and you know, many other companies don't employ a lot of these principles. So they're expecting you to be able to say, okay, this thing is going to be available in 3 months or 6 months or whatever, or they want to talk about the roadmap, and we can kind of talk in broad strokes, but you know, it's dealing with external partners is oftentimes, you know, now one of the bigger challenges. Now that, you know, I think we've reworked the organization pretty well, that things are well understood internally, but externally, you know, that's really an ongoing conversation that we have to have with, you know, especially some of our larger partners that don't operate this way, and they are really expecting a you know, 12-month detailed schedule that isn't going to be wavered from on any kind of outside input. And so, you know, continuing to figure out how to train them in a way so you can work with them and have them understand what our principles are and how we develop, and how that's actually going to be better for them in the longer term.
Yeah, it's definitely the next level of maturity is to start pushing these things outside of your organization and into your partner organizations. And the more you know, it starts out where you've got one team inside your own company that's doing this, and you're kind of pushing it into the other teams internally that support you, right? And then eventually you get them all on board, and then the next phase is to start influencing the partners and kind of growing from there. So we see that pattern with many different companies. You go, oh, wait a minute, if our partners operated this way, imagine how much more successful we'd be. So definitely right in there. So we're running out of time, but I've got one last question that I like to ask all of our guests, and I think we landed in a really good spot for this. So I'd like to ask each of you what advice you'd give to other entrepreneurs, folks in other companies that are encountering the same type of resistance that you just talked about. You're seeing other employees that maybe don't have the mindset, and you're trying to push things forward, but you're kind of hitting that internal resistance. What advice would you give to them?
I think you know, moving forward with being able to do just a single experiment and getting the green light to do that and to gather data. It just, instead of saying we're going to change the entire organization, we're going to change how we do everything, to really, you know, in a way, MVP the actual process down to a single thing that you can say, okay, we're gonna just try this once. You know, we're gonna try working this way as a team for a month, or we're gonna try releasing this one thing that's very small to gather data and learn what we should do next, or we're going to build these prototypes and get them in front of users, you know, whatever that initial step is, but to make it incredibly small, so you're not asking for quite as much permission to disrupt an entire organization, which is a hard and, you know, nearly impossible thing to do in many cases. So to start as small as possible, which I think really is at the core of Lean anyway, and to move in that way, I think is much more successful.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think Noah's exactly right about that. So much of lean planning, so much of the agile process that we've benefited from internally and all the rest, an awful lot of it is just about, it's matching that MVP mentality to say, let's just do something. So like there was a period of time early on where we hadn't done any usability testing. It's very easy to mentally go to the route of what you would do for your PhD project in usability testing, and you can make this huge construct of like how big it needs to be, how many people need to be involved, how much preparation time and staffing and resources and lab and all the rest. If you just, in our case, we work in a downtown building. There's a great coffee shop downstairs. We could go grab people and buy their coffee and get them to play with an interface. And 15 minutes from now, we would have useful feedback. There's just an aspect of getting started there. And I think as far as organizationally and dealing with resistance and other teams, I think what's really nice about that is that you get that buy-in quickly because you tend to earn it. You're creating successes and people see that and they go, oh, okay, right, well, let's turn the organization upside down, but let's do some more of that because that seems to be working. And I think, for people on staff here who had to adjust to the idea that development was going to be faster flowing and less scheduled in advance as far as big milestones and all the rest. Like the flip side of that was we very quickly established we're going to deliver high quality, reliable software and new features every 2 weeks. We're going to ship on time almost all the time. And if you have something that is really important to you for a deal, for a great idea that you think will help with marketing conversions or whatever that is, you've got the opportunity to get involved in the conversation and potentially get that into the queue and see that be live in a matter of weeks and not months or years. And I think once you start doing that, the impulse and the pressure turns way down.
Those are great tips. Very helpful. Thank you. So thank you, Josh, and thank you, Noah, and thank you, Brant. Thank you all for your time and for joining us today. I think there were some really valuable and very important nuggets in there that our clients and everybody that's watching can take away and apply right away. One thing I'd like to share that I think will help folks with that journey beyond with that journey for getting started is really if you want to take on this call to adventure and start applying these tools and techniques inside your own organization. There's a link there at the top of the screen that we'll also include in the blog post. But that gets you access to our LEAP toolkit, which is a handful of tools that will help you with getting started and applying this in your organization. And we're always here to help, so feel free to reach out on the Moves the Needle Twitter account or email or Google Plus, any of those types of things. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. See if I can stop. Oh.